All right, Unwelcome Beliefs. This is a sermon series that we're trying to spot some of the lies that significantly contribute to the issues that we're having with our mental health. And we started looking at the lie, life has no meaning. Thinking that life has no meaning, that can really mess you up, can't it? But as we looked at it a couple weeks ago, it turns out that God has designed you on purpose. He knows you. And the best explanation for meaning in this world is found in God. You are made in His image. Last week we discussed the lie that we are ruined and unacceptable, that we've done something, or maybe we've even had something done to us, and it makes us think that God couldn't possibly want anything to do with us. But as we looked at it last week, it turns out that you can't get ruined enough to make God stop caring about you or that He would lose interest in you. That the one place where we know that we'll always be accepted is with God, who values us regardless of how our value in our eyes has been wasted. Now, there's an underlying theme in those first 2 weeks, in those lies that we've looked at. Both sermons worked off of an assumption that you are loved by God. But maybe you don't have that assumption. One of the most common lies that people tell themselves is that they are not loved. That's a dangerous, dangerous lie. Now, sometimes when we refer to not being loved, we're talking about that feeling of love, the emotion of love. We want so badly to feel loved. We crave some sort of an emotion-inducing action that's going to change our lives. Women will often buy into these dreams and lies from the movies, wanting that big, grand gesture, right? And so they want the man outside the window holding up the boombox, or they want the man out in the rain just getting soaked while he's professing his love. Men want to feel loved too, but it looks different. They want a woman who pursues and desires them. They want to feel like they're up on a pedestal as if they're some sort of a king. Kids want to feel loved as well. They look to their parents for forgiveness and kindness and compassion and understanding, and those aren't unique desires to kids. We all feel that, don't we? Kids also expect their parents to give them whatever they want. That's what they think love feels like. Unfortunately, there's some adults who still think that way, don't they? We all want so badly to feel loved, even at the opposite end of that age spectrum. Our older people, they want to feel loved too. They want their family to remember and celebrate them for all the ways that they've loved through the years, because we all want to feel loved. But it's not just about a feeling or an emotion. It's something bigger than that. Love is more than just a feeling or emotion. It's a commitment. Love is more than just an emotion. The Bible actually has a word for that. It's from the Greek language. It's a word agape. That means a sacrificial, committed type of a love. And maybe you don't use that word agape, but you know that it should exist. And maybe that's part of your story. Maybe you know this kind of love should exist in your life, but the reason you buy the lie that you aren't loved is that for you it wasn't a lie. Maybe you weren't loved by the people who should have loved you. Your story might be about parents who did not display or demonstrate love. Your story is about maybe a spouse that you married for that agape kind of love, the committed love, but then they backed out on their commitment and they abandoned you. Or maybe you had friends who left you. You know, you'd built relationships with the ones that you thought were going to love you unconditionally, no matter what, but then they've walked away and they've left you alone, and you've started believing that you aren't loved. Because all the evidence points in that direction. And if that's your story, and if you've come to the conclusion that you're not loved, you're in a very vulnerable place. Because it's likely that you'll begin to tolerate lesser relationships. Relationships without real love, that real, true agape love. And when you don't feel love, you're going to settle for anything that resembles it. And so maybe you date someone, or maybe you marry someone out of desperation, not out of wisdom. Maybe you've accepted relationships that are, like at worst, abusive, or at best, maybe they just take advantage of you. Maybe you look at your life and you see a string of broken, unfulfilling relationships that prove that you've never been loved, and that's where this specific issue intersects with our mental health. When we don't feel loved, whether that's the emotional side or that commitment side, it doesn't matter. When people have failed us, or maybe we just don't feel it the way that we think we ought to, When that's the case, we start accepting lies that begin to eat at us. And it starts with, no one loves you. It starts with, I'm not loved. And maybe it's true that someone who should have loved you failed you. Maybe the people who were supposed to love you didn't love you. But we start buying into this lie that no one loves us, and it is a lie. And it grows. And it becomes a second lie. It moves from no one loves you to now you're never going to be loved. It's not just about the moment that you're in now, not just about the broken relationship that you have now. We take how we feel in this moment, we project it into our future, assuming it's always going to be that way. And we let that lie take root. It grows until eventually we say, you're unlovable. It's not that you're never going to be loved. You lie to yourself and you begin thinking that the problem is that you aren't actually worth loving. No one's ever going to find you lovable. Eventually, that lie grows until you begin believing that you don't even love yourself. And you wonder, how is it possible for anyone else to love you if you don't love yourself? These lies are just like digging a hole. You tell yourself that you're trying to get out of this place, but you're only getting into a deeper and darker place. Your pain gets deeper and deeper. Your hope gets smaller and smaller. And we find ourselves in an unhealthy place, a very dangerous place. Studies show that people who don't feel loved are likely to struggle with anxiety and depression, as well as a whole other host of mood disorders. We're talking about moments in our mental health when we've accepted these lies that life has no meaning, that I'm ruined or that I'm not loved. They begin to destroy us. And when we accept them as true, it puts us in dark places. These lies especially destroy us when we don't recognize them as lies. And I think the best way to identify a lie is to know the truth. My wife and I, we like to plant gardens. I say we, it's mostly her, okay, but we do this together. And we moved into a new house last summer, and so this summer we put in our first garden here in Frankfurt, okay? And it's puny, it's small, it's step one, okay? Like it's a process. And so we're trying to build it up. Now, one of the struggles that I have whenever we first plant a garden, every season, every spring when we do this, is dealing with weeds or grasses or other things that grow that you don't want to be growing there, right? Now, my problem isn't that I don't like pulling them. I actually enjoy pulling weeds. It's this weird, strange hobby that's been passed down through the Webb family line for several generations. One of my grandma Webb's favorite things to do was stand in the yard and find weeds and pull them. That's what she did for fun, all right? So my problem isn't that I don't like it. My problem is that I'm not good at identifying weeds, especially in that early gardening season, right? When you first plant the garden and things start popping up out of the soil, it's hard for me to tell the difference between a weed and like a tomato plant or a pepper plant. I don't know what it's supposed to be. I don't know what's actually growing. And so then I'm scared to pull anything out of the garden, out of the soil, because I don't know if it's a weed or if it's actually something that I wanted. Weeds are kind of like lies, aren't they? A weed grows in the place where you're actively trying to grow things. A lie grows in the place of the truth that you want to build your life around. Weeds grow where you're trying to grow things. Lies grow in places where you want there to be truth. A weed will grow quickly and aggressively, exactly the way you wish your garden would grow. It does exactly what you're hoping would happen. A lie does the same thing. A lie is going to take root and it's going to grow aggressively, working to convince you that it's the truth. And the best way to identify a weed is to know what you've planted. You don't need to study every possible weed known to man. You don't need to study every plant known to man. There's too many for you to know and to master, right? You just need to know what the leaves of the tomato plant look like. You need to know what the leaves of the pepper plant look like. You need to know what the leaves of what you want look like. Do you know that bankers do the same thing with counterfeit money? They don't study all the variations of counterfeits. They just study the real thing. And I think it's the same with lies. Satan's not limited in the lies at his disposal. You can't possibly root out every lie that you've been taught over the years simply by trying to find lies. You have to know the truth. I'm not loved is a lie straight from the lips of Satan. And I don't think you can defeat it without knowing the truth. The one source of love you can count on is God. And yet he's the one source of love we seem to care the least about. He's the one source of love that's not going to fade or grow cold. He's the one source of love that's not going to be denied. He's the one source of love that will always forgive. He's the one source of love that will always celebrate you. And that's why we say confidently that this is a lie. This idea that I am not loved is an absolute lie, because you will never find yourself outside of the love of God. And I can't make you feel loved today. I wish I could. I wish that there was something I could do. Prayerfully, I hope that for some of you in the room, you will feel loved, or that you will feel embraced by God today. That would be really cool. But what I can do is I can show you how loved you are. And I want to start at the end of the story. It's in 1 John chapter 4. We come across this passage from a guy named John. He's writing this years after Jesus has died and resurrected and then ascended back into heaven. Years later, John, we know him maybe as the Apostle John, or he was the disciple John who followed Jesus for 3 years. Years later, he writes these words. He says, "Dear friends, let us love one another." And it's a famous passage about how we can love one another, but then he adds this phrase, "For love comes from God." Love comes from God. In the next verse, John's going to say, God is love. And a few verses later, he's going to reemphasize God is love. John is making the case that anytime love exists, it's an extension of God's love. But I want you to notice what he isn't saying. John isn't saying that God is loving, even though that's true. John isn't saying that one of God's activities is to love us, even though that's also true. What he's saying is that God is love. All of his activity is loving. Love is the essence of God's existence. Even the things that God does that we may not connect to the idea of love are, in fact, acts of love. They're done in love. Even things like this, like when God judges, and he will. He holds accountable the right and the wrong in this world. He holds accountable and calls out what is good and what is evil. But it's an act of love. God's judgment is an act of love. Think about it from the perspective of being a parent. When you hold your kids accountable, it is an act of love. And it's the same with God. When he judges in love, he's loving. So then whenever he makes right what has been done wrong, when he enacts justice, his justice is an act of love. Because everything God does is an act of love. When John says these words and he writes this out confidently and he says God is love, John didn't come up with this idea about God. He got it from Jesus. And if you go back to Jesus early on in his ministry, one of the most famous verses in the entire Bible, John 3:16, we sang it just a minute ago, reveals this core message. For God so loved the world. It's not a new idea when John writes that God is a loving God. Jesus shows up, and this was central. This was core to his message. It's the central message of the New Testament. It is exactly why Jesus came into this world, to show, to prove, to tell about the love of God. God's love is clearly what Jesus proclaimed, and it's the message that his disciples carried in the first century. It's not surprising that John would say what he does in his letter at the end of the New Testament, emphasizing a God who is love. It's not surprising because he'd sat at the feet of Jesus for years, listening to Jesus over and over and over, driving home this point of the love of God. But the message of love didn't start with Jesus. It culminated with Jesus, but it didn't start there. If you go into the Old Testament, you're going to find writings from this guy named Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, and he's addressing the nation of Israel, and he speaks to them, and he reminds them of what happened in the past when God had rescued them out of Egypt, and he says, because he loved your forefathers. Because he loved your forefathers. That's the foundation. It's because he loved their forefathers and that he is loving. And sure, like for real, the nation that heard this, the Israelites who heard this, they thought that this was a special message just for them. They didn't think of God in terms of loving humanity. They thought they just loved their nation. But you can look through the Old Testament, you'll find lots of other places where God goes out of the way to prove his love for all. So when Jesus arrives on the scene, the Jewish people had heard for centuries about a God who loved them. And it may not have been like the thing that they focused on the most from this God, but they'd heard of it. They knew of it. They understood God to be a living and a personal and an active and a loving God. And many of them missed it. Many of them missed that it was fulfilled, that it was proven in the person of Jesus. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he sent his son. Jesus' existence in this world is proof. It's evidence of the love of God. In 1 John 4, where John tells us to love one another because love comes from God. There's no love, only true love outside of God because God is love. Now we mess it up. We're broken. We love in all sorts of ways that are dishonoring and take away from the goodness that God has created. But God himself, he is love, and love comes from God. And in this same passage, as John is just making all these huge statements on what love is, in verse 9 he says, this is how God showed his love among us. He sent his son. It's proof. Jesus' existence is the proof of the love of God. And if you throw that up against the lies that we've been looking at, lies like life has no meaning, or lies like I am ruined or unacceptable to God, lies like I am not loved, these are lies straight from the lips of Satan because he wants to destroy your relationship. He wants to pull you away from your God. And the truth is, God loves you. That's the message. The fact that God loves you is exactly why Jesus showed up in the first place. These weeds, these lies that pop up, they overwhelm us and they drag us down. They distract us and destroy everything that should be growing, the things that we want to be growing in our life. But the truth is the thing that needs to stick. The truth is what needs to stay. The truth and knowing the truth is what helps us be able to remove the lies that are trying to take us out. And so you need to know the truth. God loves you. That's the message from the beginning to the present. It's going to be the message at the end. Jesus' time on earth was the ultimate confirmation of this truth. And if it's true that God is love, and if it's true that God loves you, and that God loves me, then there's some other lies, some sub-lies, some lower level, what I would call like love lies. Lies that we buy about who God is, and lies that we need to attack with some truth. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is a famous passage that you're probably familiar with. You've probably heard it at weddings. And if you've been to church for a decent length of time in your life, then you've probably heard sermons on this passage, right? You're likely going to be familiar with this text. And as we start going through it, you're going to recognize a lot of the language. And you've probably heard this passage, this text, taught in relationship to one another in a very appropriate way, right? As it should be. And so you've heard this passage applied to things like marriages, a husband and a wife, or maybe applied towards friends and relationships between two friends. Maybe you've even heard this applied in the relationship between parents and children in their relationship with one another. It's an appropriate way to use this text. This passage, though, it isn't a teaching text to explain how to be more loving. It's a teaching text showing us what love is. It's bigger than just how to become more loving. It's telling us what acts of love are, what love looks like, what the essence of love is. And if this is telling us what love is, and if it's true that God is love, then this text is revealing the nature of God to us. It's telling us who God is. This passage tells us 15 different things about what love is and who God is, and it directly attacks so many lies about God that we believe. Starting in verse 4, love is patient. In verse 5, we're told love is not easily angered. I've linked these two together because it's a similar thought. These are truths of who God is and what love is, but we believe the lies. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought things like this? God is sick and tired of me. Have you ever thought God is tired of hearing the things that I'm complaining about? Have you ever felt like God is tired of your prayers? Like he gets wore out from you asking him to fix all your stuff? You ever feel like God is tired of your failures? Or that he's exhausted from all the times he's had to forgive you? You ever thought just flat out he's tired of you? Maybe you've thought, how could God feel anything but anger towards me? He never gets a break from my stupid choices. He has to be worn out, right? These are lies straight from Satan. Because the truth is, love is patient. And the truth is, love is not easily angered. And our God is love. And that means that God is patient. It means that God is not easily angered. And you've got to attack those lies. We move on. Love is kind. Love is not rude. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in truth. These are truths of God. But we buy the lies. We have ideas like this: I'm a mess, which is pretty true. We partner with I'm disgusting to God. That's a lie. We believe that the difficulty we're facing, like the pain or the hurt in life, that my difficulty in my life is actually the punishment of God. We believe that if God were here talking to me right now, that he would just tell me all the awful things that I've done. We believe that God could be harsh with me if we were having a conversation with him right now. We think that there's too much in my life to be forgiven, that forgiveness is for people who are better than me, right? I've gone too far. I'm past the point of being forgiven. We buy the lie that God's just looking for an opportunity to judge us, that he wants to catch us, like he's sneaking around the corner. He wants us to pay for what we've done. Have you ever felt any of those things? I have. And these are lies straight from the lips of Satan. Because the truth is, love is kind. The truth is, love is not rude, right? Love keeps no record of wrongs, and love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices in the truth. And God is love. And so we're not even talking about love. We're saying God is kind. God is not rude to you. God, even though he will one day judge, he is not one who wants to just sit and keep record of wrongs. He isn't trying to build a case against us. God doesn't delight in evil, but he rejoices in truth. Love does not envy. Love is not self-seeking. That's true. We buy the lies. We think that God is like this big, great buzzkill in the sky. He doesn't want us having too much fun because then he might be jealous of us. And that's kind of weird thought, maybe. Okay, maybe jealousy isn't exactly the word that you would use there, right? But we kind of have that idea. A lot of people believe that God doesn't want us to be happy. In fact, he kind of wants us to suffer, according to most people. Some people think God is like that grumpy old man who wants you to stay off his lawn. And so he wants everyone else to be unhappy just like he is. Have you bought that lie? Maybe you think that all of the opportunities that you've had to bless God, you've missed them. And so you feel like you're of no use to God, that he's not interested in you if you're not going to find some way to help him out, right? That's not God. That's us. We're self-seeking. Because the truth is, love doesn't envy, and love is not self-seeking, and God is love, so that means that God doesn't envy, and he's not trying to squash our happiness and our joy. God is not self-seeking. He isn't up there just waiting for us to do something special for him. Love is not boastful. Love is not proud. Have you ever felt like God was too good for you? Maybe you would recognize the lie from the other perspective that you're not good enough for him, that you don't deserve him. Kind of like God's a celebrity and like you really shouldn't be seen in his presence. Like maybe God is ashamed of you, that you could kind of just make him look bad if you're around him, right? You ever felt like God doesn't want to be seen with you? Have you ever felt like you're not welcome at church? Maybe you've heard these words, maybe you've said them, where someone said that if they showed up at church, the roof would cave in, or that it might like catch fire, something like that. Man, these are lies straight from the lips of Satan, where he's trying to convince you that God doesn't love you, that God can't love you, and that you're beyond him ever caring, that he's above you, as if he's too proud, that he's too good for us. No, the truth says that love does not boast. Love is not proud, and our God is love. And so God does not boast, and God is not proud. Love always protects. Love always trusts. Love always hopes. Love always perseveres. That's the truth, but we buy the lies. We think that God has abandoned me, that he's left me to suffer. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever felt alone? And look, there are those moments in life, there's consequences in life, but it doesn't mean that God has turned his back on you. In fact, you may not have any clue as to the ways in which God is actually in this moment currently protecting you. We don't buy that. We think he's just kind of left us to suffer, and sometimes it feels that way. We think that God expects us to fail, that he doesn't believe in us, which that's a wild idea. That one makes no sense. The idea that God would trust me, that's a weird idea. We believe that God would expect us to fail. That makes way more sense, right? It's a lie. We believe that God has given up on us, that we're never going to be able to please him, that he's lost hope in us, that we're never going to be able to do anything that's going to make him happy. We think that God, again, is just tired of us and he's worn out, and it's all lies. All of these are lies straight from Satan, because love always protects. It doesn't abandon you. Love always trusts, which is such a wild, wild idea that somehow God would trust me, that God would hope in me, because that's the truth, because love always hopes. And we're talking about God as love, and so that means that God always hopes. Love always perseveres. That means that God always perseveres. God never fails, because love never fails. And we don't always believe it. Maybe you've been in that spot where you felt like God has failed you, but it's a lie. Love never fails. God never fails. If you have any hope, if you have any hope of pushing back against some of these weeds, some of these lies that have grown up in our lives, then you've got to leave some of those things behind. You've got to cling to the truth. You've got to be able to start recognizing what the truth is. Because if you don't recognize the truth, then the lies are going to overcome you. The lies will overwhelm you just like they can a garden. And if you don't start identifying what you want to grow, the things that you want to grow are going to start being overcome by the things that you wish weren't there. Maybe you feel it. Maybe you felt it. Maybe you've thought it. Maybe you've lived as if nobody loves you. But you're wrong. It's a lie from the enemy who wants you to struggle and wants you to suffer, and you need to know you're wrong. God loves you. And you can never reach the point of being unlovable. God is patient with you. God is not fragile. You can't just easily anger him. He's kind to you. He doesn't want to punish you. Sometimes he does. Sometimes there are consequences to our behavior. Sometimes there's discipline because he's a good father, but it is not an act of unlove. It is an act of love. He loves you. He's not up there looking to just catch you in a failure. He wants to forgive you. This is mind-blowing to me. God enjoys, he loves forgiveness. It's wild. God is not too good for you. God's feelings are not hurt because of your failure. God celebrates when you do good. He doesn't attack you. He protects you. God trusts you. Wild idea. God hopes in you. Crazy idea. God doesn't quit on you. God never fails. I think one of the big problems we have is that we don't crave the love of God like we do the love of people. But I think we should. And what if the opposite were true? What if God didn't love us, but people did? It's a far worse scenario. Guys, we have a God who loves us. We have a God who loves us. You have a God who loves you. You, seriously, you have a God who loves you. And you've got to stop believing the lies. You have to start believing the truth. I want to encourage you to accept that today. Now, I don't know what that looks like for you. It may look like several different things. Maybe you want to come up and have a conversation